Without further ado, stage is yours. Please just remember that we will ask you for questions towards the end, but if you have burning questions, I'm sure she might be able to improvise. Go ahead.
All right, well, thanks everybody. Very much appreciated all the talk of innovation this morning. I think it's been exciting so far, and we're excited to open this up to more discussion. I think we've put together a great panel here that represents different perspectives from the innovation ecosystem, and we'd like to have a higher-level chat about, how do we get innovation to the market? I think we're to some degree working in our own spheres, so bringing everybody together will help give us a better perspective, better awareness of what some of those challenges are and how we together partner to find those solutions that help get us there. I think, and so I guess this first question goes out to our faculty members. It's not just the science and the innovation, the technology that we're developing, but in part, it's about getting our entrepreneurs enthusiastic about bringing this out. And I was wondering if Bob and Tyler, you could provide a little bit of perspective on how you are helping to shape some of those students to get them enthusiastic about bringing this to the market.
Well, I think, I'll speak for myself and a little bit for the Koch Institute, and then Tyler, I'm sure, can expand on that. But I think actually when Tyler, became in charge and put together the Koch Institute, that was actually one of the stated goals. And I would say classically, that has not really been a stated goal of a lot of academic departments. It's a lot of times it's to do pure science. And again, I'm sure that wasn't necessarily so easy for him to really convince everybody. But I think today, I think that's viewed, again, I don't want to speak, but by and large, quite positively. For me, as I mentioned in my talk, I'm an engineer. I love seeing the things that happen in our lab go out to the world. And I don't think you can just do that at MIT. We can't do manufacturing. We're not going to do clinical trials. To me, I think our lab has been very active in it. I think it probably has to do, to me, with role models, which are students. All the companies that we've started have been pretty much with current or former students. And I think the newer students, they see other people have done that. And I think they see that it can be a really exciting, rewarding career path, and I think that they've decided to do it. Armon would be a very good example to ask. He can probably speak better than I about that, but I think that was a decision he had to make, because he actually, I still remember, when he did his thesis with myself and Klaus Jensen, he was thinking about for a little bit about a more traditional career path and, doing a postdoc, which he was doing. But then I remember we sat down one day and, said, well, what are your dreams? And he, really wanted to create companies and technologies, and particularly the technologies that he pioneered, and get them out to the world and save and improve lives. And I think that that's a wonderful mission. And I think, again, just the very fact that he did it, I think that lowers the bar for other students to see that maybe they could someday do it too.
So I'll just add a couple of things. I think when we started the Koch, we had various taglines associated with what we were trying to do, and just phrases. And two of them are relevant here. One, collaboration and integration. So we explicitly talked about the importance of collaboration. I think that creates sort of an environment where people are thinking, sharing, going beyond what they're doing in their individual labs. And that's made a big difference for us. That sense of collaboration and integration across disciplines, is very pervasive in our environment. I think it opens people's minds up to what's possible. And the second tagline, which is even more relevant to this, is discoveries and solutions. So especially in science, we tend to be discovery oriented. And we use our talents to figure out the answers to the next question. But there's always a question after that, and we typically then dig into answering that question. But the solutions part is equally important. How are you going to take that information and move it to something that's actually going to make a difference practically? And we're lucky that we have people like Bob and many of our engineering colleagues who think about that more naturally than do the scientists in our environment. But that's now kind of washed over everybody. And there's a real sense that part of what we're doing there is to move beyond our discoveries into solutions. And you can do that different ways. You can do it in an academic environment, but frankly, it's not easy. And it's a much more straightforward path, as Bob and others have shown, to either partner with existing companies or spin new companies out. There's a statistic which I like to share with people. In the Koch, and here I'm talking about not just the faculty whose labs are located in our building, but also those who are associated with us. And it's roughly an equal number. It's about 52 labs in total. Since 2007, when the Koch was formed, there have been 42 companies started. And that's part of the reason for that is partly due to the fact that this is now an expectation, that we not just allow it, we encourage it. And I think that that's now part of who we are.
Maybe as a follow-up, Armon, since you were kind of a recipient of this collaboration and kind of encouragement to start Squeeze, maybe you could talk a little bit about your experience and how it deviated from that more traditional path of kind of pursuing research and a postdoc and whatnot.
Right. I mean, so I think there were two major elements that the environment that Bob and Tyler have created really helped that translation. So one of them was really that collaboration element within the Koch and with the rest of the MIT community, but it was especially strong within the Koch. And that was really critical for us because when we kind of developed the technology at first, we were a bunch of chemical engineers who kind of knew we had a fancy device that could do something. We had no idea what to do with it. And I distinctly recall this. One of Bob's first suggestions was, why don't you get a bunch of different scientists from the lab or from the Koch into a room and see what they can think of. And everyone had all kinds of ideas that we would have never thought of on our own, and the immunology side was actually something that was furthest from our expertise. But to some people, this could solve a very obvious problem. And so we started collaborating across labs within the Koch, like with Daryl Irvin and Chris Love, to try to figure out what we can do that would be very useful there. So that helped really nurture and develop the technology in that environment. And then you get to that kind of transition point that Tyler and Bob were talking about, where you're going away from discovery but starting to get to the solutions. And that's where the conventional paths or the conventional funding sources get a little bit less excited. I mean, so one quote I remember from one of my advisors is that you're going to get the Nature paper from curing a mouse. No one's going to care once you translate that to humans.
Or you're going to take that personally, Bob.
Right? Yeah. It's unless you get the phase 3 clinical trial, then maybe it'll be New England Journal of Medicine. But that's like 10 years away. No one's going to fund that. And it's not feasible to do within that academic setting. So it really came down to this question of, do you want to do more discovery, or do you want to try to actually translate this over? And again, I think the environment created at the Koch and in labs like Bob's, it goes away from that more traditional academic view where you're kind of a trader if you go to the company side. And it was like, no, this is a necessary part of the translation. And so that's what really helped us kind of move there and go in that direction.
Great, thanks. Moving away from that, taking those first steps, starting the company, putting together your team of advisors, this is a question, I suppose, more so for the entrepreneurs, but there are a number of challenges that any company is going to be facing in those early days and even as you progress further. To some degree, it'd be great to hear about some of the challenges that you may be facing and how this startup exchange and ILP have helped to bring together other collaborators, other thought partners as you help that company move along and meet its next milestones. Erik, do you want to start?
Sure. So is this on? Yeah. So I think first from the perspective of what we've done at AssayQuant Technologies, it's really been, again, a warp speed transition from August when we started the company to where we are now, where we just started to commercialize products. So we brought together really strong science with really strong business and understanding of the markets and how do you productize the ideas. So that's gone very well in terms of getting good voice of customer to drive roadmaps. What's difficult is navigating all of the financial and structural elements to make sure that that's streamlined and productive. And so I think that's an area where that MIT could serve that more. And I think the interactions with ILP and the interactions with VMS that we've had, have sort of complemented it, but not addressed specifically, the guts of how you start a company.
Let me chip in. I think the potential barriers or stigma between industry and academia have been, those still exist in a lot of circumstances. But initiatives like what MIT is doing here really destroy those barriers, which is really what we need to do. And I mean, on the company side, I think it's really the company's responsibility to make sure it drives strategy and product development and research in ways that fully utilize what has been done in academia and take that ball and carry it forward into the clinic and into practical therapies for patients, which means and has to mean continued engagement with academia, particularly to answer questions that companies just are not addressed to answer, but also generally seek strategic guidance where the company can't assume that it knows best, which I think means a few things. It means very close relationships with certain academic institutions. It means hopefully a really great group of founders, of scientific founders who are intimately involved in the company, potentially on a daily basis. It also means close formal collaborations and projects that the company can work intimately with academic colleagues. And I think if you do all that, then interests align and hopefully you get pointed in the right direction.
Yeah, I would say you mentioned that companies need to know what they know and know what they don't know. The same is true for the academics and the scientific founders. I mean, we too have our own perspective and have our own tendencies and our own sort of trajectories, which are useful and very important in getting things started. But I think we also have to recognize our own limitations in terms of understanding what the markets are and how to address challenges that will inevitably take place when you move an idea from the lab into a business setting. So I think the most successful companies, startups and beyond, are ones that respect between what we know scientifically and what business people know based on their experiences come together harmoniously, and that there's not a fight between the two.
And I think that's an important point. I think having been associated with platform companies, there's some exciting innovations that come out of academic lab, but then taking that to a commercial setting. And so people should not underestimate the challenge to go from really exciting Nature paper observation to actually trying to figure out if this particular technology can be applied in a commercial setting. Yeah. So it takes a huge learning curve and set of expertise and of course lots of funding to actually make that transition from a really cool science to a more practical application. So I think that's that's where a lot of companies, for example, Synologic, initially professors Jim Collins and Tim Lu, I mean, they had this really cool ideas in their labs about synthetic biology and what they can do with them, but not really understanding what can be done in a medical or commercial setting for treating diseases or developing therapeutics. So they went to a local venture capital group like Atlas Ventures and said, hey, we have this cool idea and technology, can you help us figure out commercial applications? So they incubated the company for about a year at Atlas with some small amount of seed money, and then asked some very specific questions to test the hypothesis. And once the data came in a positive way, then they launched the company with the Series A and then subsequent funding. So I think there are a number of different ways that you can try to address a challenge.
Katherine, can I ask you to speak a little bit and tell us a little bit about Sunrise Ventures and how you may be partnering with entrepreneurs and helping nurture their companies?
Sure, and actually it just continues on with the discussion that we've just been having related to how do you bridge the gaps between academic science, industry, and then actually the importance of the venture capital community for us and as well as the whole ecosystem. So I was the only one who didn't give a talk earlier. I'll give a brief introduction. I'm Kathy Bowdish. I'm the head of Sunrise Ventures at Sanofi. So I've been at Sanofi for 3 years now, and I came in to build and lead Sunrise. My past experience prior to joining Sanofi is all in early stage biotech. So I founded a first company right after my postdoc that was in the area of antibody therapies, coming out of some work I had done quite a long time ago with Richard Lerner and Dennis Burton at the Scripps Research Institute. In fact, as I was looking at that, thinking about launching a company, I was also looking at a second postdoc, an industry position, et cetera, and thought I'm going to do the highest risk endeavor of all of the choices. And in fact, the company I was looking at before was out of business in about 6 months later, and I was glad I didn't do the second postdoc. And the company I ended up launching at the time I was with that company for 10 years. And from angel investor money, large pharma partnerships, acquisition by a public company, and then I was running the San Diego division of the public company. And then I left that entity and started another company, this time with venture investors in the area of trivalent biologics, and then came to the East Coast 4 years ago to lead an Arch flagship funded company called Permion Biologics that came out of Harvard, out of David Liu's lab. While I was at Permion, I was recruited by Elias Zerhouni to build and lead Sunrise. And the whole goal for Sunrise is to bridge those gaps between academia, large pharma, and the venture community. And so, we can operate in a whole variety of ways. But what our goal is to take really great academic science, especially in areas where maybe the founder's been working on something for most of their academic career, and now is the time to really move it into an applied setting. And we really embrace these ideas, and what we're trying to do is find a mechanism to accelerate treatments to patients. And so with most of our relationships, it's really kind of wrapping your arms around the academic investigator, keeping them happy, keeping them engaged, and then opening the doors to Sanofi. So by offering all of the expertise, capabilities, resources within large pharma to help to nurture these investments. And then the venture community comes in, and they're also equally important to us because they can help to share risk with us. They've drafted, they're in the business of drafting business plans. They can help us sometimes with management because now we're in a position where we can launch new companies straight out of academia. We can seed a company ourselves, or we can work with the venture community and co-create a company around some academic science. It might be just one academic investigator, maybe it's a group of academic investigators from one institution or from multiple institutions. But there are lots of ways that we make investments and really partner. And I should say all of our investments it's an equity investment, but it's also a deep collaboration around some specific programs. And we are a very small team, but we really engage very senior level individuals within Sanofi that play a role in these companies and really help to foster the success. And this is because we take strategic rights as well to some programs. And so when we want to see the success of our programs, but at the same time we recognize that the entrepreneur probably wants to build a company that can last for the long term. And so how do we, our goal then is to be successful in the programs that we bring in, but at the same time provide the necessary validation for the rest of the platform such that the company can continue to have a life beyond Sanofi. And so that's, just in terms of bridging those gaps, I think that Sunrise is, in my view, a pretty good way of really trying to take advantage of the strengths that each of these groups bring together, but also address the gaps.
One of the things that comes out of that, and you probably touched a little bit on this, and I'd invite you to kind of comment on this, but perhaps Robert, you as well, coming from a venture background in your days, there are so many exciting innovations that are out there, right? We've heard about just a handful today, but everything ranging from different types of assay technologies, diagnostics, therapeutics of various types. When it comes to working with companies, making an investment, can you tell us a little bit about how you make those choices, how you prioritize amongst all the various technologies that are out there?
Just for full disclosure, I worked 5 years in venture, including for Fraser Healthcare Ventures, working on biotech investments. The one comment I would say is that it's a really tough business. It's not really what it seems, and there are a lot of examples, particularly in the tech world and software world, that if you create a Twitter or you create a Facebook, yeah, you can earn 100 times your investment. Never happens in healthcare, and particularly with therapeutics. And unfortunately, it takes tens or potentially hundreds of millions of dollars to get to truly meaningful milestones where this is a therapy that will really make a difference in patients' lives. But that being said, I think that there's different approaches. There are incremental approaches where you're making something more convenient or a little safer, or there are these truly transformative approaches that could revolutionize current standard of care. And I think you have to focus on all of those, because all of them are unaddressed needs. Some will are kind of moonshots, and that's fine. But with that high reward comes high risk. But some are, the more incremental ones, you can see a much more natural path to get there. I think as humans, we are always more optimistic than we that we should be. And so I think particularly once you start commercializing, that's where you look at plan B, plan C. That's when you look at risk mitigation. That's when you look at practical development pathways and clinical trial designs that can take into account risks and circumstances where it may not play out in your favor.
In terms of what we look for, so Sunrise Ventures actually operates across all of Sanofi. So that's a pretty big mandate in terms of diabetes, oncology, autoimmune, infectious disease, animal health, just a whole variety of areas of interest to the company. And we're a very small team, so we do try to cover that landscape as best we can. But what we look for we look for areas that are truly transformative. And so there are a couple of sort of checkbox that we like to think about as we're looking at different opportunities. Is it truly transformative, or does it fit more in the incremental improvement space? So transformative is where we like to be. We like to look at opportunities, although we don't like to set rules around this, but usually it's not just a single asset that could come into Sanofi, because in some ways there's no real reason to necessarily form a company around that, especially for the way we operate. You could certainly form a company, but that might be fit outside of what Sunrise looks for. We look for things that are of strategic interest to Sanofi, but something that we're just not doing in-house. We're not doing it because we don't have the expertise, or we're not doing it because we don't have the IP around it, but of strategic interest to the different areas. And also we look for things that are 3 to 5 years-ish to an IND. And so what that really means to us is that if we're launching a company from an academic lab, or investing in something that's fairly newly created, they don't have to have a lead asset. They don't have to have there just has to be some interesting biology. And the validation of the opportunity doesn't even necessarily need to come from that particular lab or that particular new company. It just has to be sort of somewhere in the universe, so that we can get comfortable that this is something that has a fairly good likelihood of success. But you have to balance that with, when it's transformative, we know it's high risk, and we're pretty comfortable in the high risk setting. And so we gauge our investments, based on addressing some of the key risks that we see that the company or the platform or the programs actually might encounter. So we've done, just to give you some examples, we've done an investment in needle-free drug delivery. Actually, that's out of MIT. That's with Ian Hunter, who's a second most prolific inventor behind Bob.
Well, he's great. I'm on their advisory board. I think they're doing great stuff.
Yeah, it's a very exciting company. We see this as number one, you're dealing with needle-phobic patients, but at the same time, we think it has a lot of opportunity in the integrated care space and compliance and et cetera. We've also made a large investment in cardiovascular disease. We've done something in oncology. In fact, that initial, the company, the oncology company I'm referring to is called Warp Drive Bio. So they were, the original investment in that case was a co-creation with Third Rock Ventures. It was not always focused just on oncology. It was really more of a broad platform, and now it's more focused, at least with our relationship, the Sanofi relationship, in oncology, but also another program in infectious disease that uses their big genome database. And more recently, we've got another, actually I can't announce another one, but we've just recently done a new company out of Stanford that we're really excited about for new small molecule drug discovery that can actually span all therapeutic areas. And a few others that are active in the works. Actually, I should say we did one in the animal health space, believe it or not, as well. And so this one has a pretty bold goal of trying to remove antibiotics from the food chain. And so as you can see, the investments are very, very diverse in terms of where we look and how we operate. But it's mostly transformative, some level of validation somewhere, 3 to 5 years to an IND. And I should also say we're a really small team, so we can't actually be very proactive. We can only be reactive at the size that we are. And so you have to reach me. It's hard for me to reach out and pay attention to everything that's going on.
Sure. I mean, the environment is constantly shifting. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, and maybe this is a good opportunity to switch gears, but with our environment changing, there are things that are going on the macro level in terms of, how much is basic research being supported by funding? Is that funding going elsewhere? I guess this is an opportunity to talk about perhaps what our academic researchers and entrepreneurs, what do you see as some of those opportunities that we can seize in the environment that we have today? And I guess as a corresponding question, what are some of the challenges that we need to be mindful of that put more roadblocks in the way? And I think, again, that's going to be helpful for us as we think about how do we be aware of some of those challenges so that we can help partner and overcome those.
So maybe I'll take a stab at this to get started. I think the environment with respect to funding in academia is still under strain, as I think everybody is aware. Funding from the federal sources is flat or declining. We're hopeful in cancer that the moonshot might solve our problems. We'll see. I'm not too optimistic, but that's forced us to look elsewhere and diversify our portfolio of funding. And so that includes philanthropic sources, it includes foundations to a greater degree than in the past, and it includes companies. And we have noticed that companies, small and large, are seemingly much more open-minded about interactions with us. And we likewise are much more open-minded about interactions with them. So we've established many either programmatic interactions or one-off interactions. I don't know the specific percentage of funding coming from industry sources today, but it's dramatically higher. So that's a good thing because it means better access to those companies. It means dollars, but better access, meaningful interactions, coordination. It does have some downsides. There are IP issues and so forth, academic freedom issues. But in our experience, where there's a will, there's a way. You can usually work through those issues, usually, not always. So that's something that's changing, I think, for me, for the good.
And I could actually add to that maybe, just in terms of how when Sanofi, and in particular when Sunrise is working with academic investigators, if we're, I can say this is, at least typical in terms of our relationship. If we're funding work in the lab and then we actually create then a company around that, we contribute the IP, so we usually have an option on the IP that's coming from the academic lab, but we contribute that to the company such that we don't actually have a hangover the IP that is going into the entity. And so through that contribution, it means that we're actually getting the IP that we need to go forward if the programs succeed, but also you're building a company that can be independent in its own right.
How about from our entrepreneurs, any perspective on kind of some of the macro level changes that are taking place, making things either more challenging or opportunities that you see? I think that, the greater Massachusetts area, the greater Boston area is probably one of the greatest places to be as a startup, just because there are so many resources. It's a community that is very supportive of innovation and startups, but would be great to hear kind of how you see that.
Sure. I mean, I can take a stab at it. So, I mean, on the one hand, there was, I'll call it, the pre-company phase of how we dealt with funding, because over there was this interesting thing, whereas Tyler referred to with the federal sources, sometimes, they'll say they want innovation, but they're actually scared of anything that's too new. They prefer it be like news from 5 years ago that you're now telling them about, and they often actually end up giving you prize money for things you already did, as opposed to saying, I don't have data, I just want to do this. And that's something where the newer sources, like the philanthropy and the companies that give organizations like the Koch funding or MIT, they induce these smaller grant programs that, at least in my experience, were much better about funding these new ideas. So for example, the Koch had the innovation grants, which were smaller grants, but they were much quicker to get. The review process was, I would say, more friendly to newer programs, and they understood that they're just taking a chance on these things, and probably 9 out of 10 won't work, but the 1 out of 10 that do could make a big difference. So that was something that seemed to be making a difference there. On the company side, with the federal funding, things like the NSF and NIH SBIR programs, they can be quite helpful. I think the one area for improvement with them is it takes so long for them to actually approve it and then give you the money. It's probably 9 months after you applied, and for most startups, you're alive or dead by then anyway. So for us, it was this funny situation where we would apply, for example, to an NIH grant, and it would be, I think, $225K. And at the time we're applying, we're like, this would make such a huge difference for us. And then 9 months later, by the time we get it, this is like, okay, this is half a month's cash burn. Do we really care at this point? And so if for those programs,
it's a good problem to have.
That's true. That's true. But it's a case where if they want to make a more meaningful difference, they would probably have to figure out a way to really, really shorten those timelines, because 9 months is a lot in the life of a startup.
I think the funding situation, even for a startup, is getting more challenging, right? So until middle of last year, the public markets were really booming for biotech. So people would, found a company, do a Series A, immediately do a crossover, think about an IPO. Now I think, there's been a general pullback across all sectors. So biotech is no exception. And so biotech is usually considered very high risk, so that's where the capital usually leaves first. That's a sector, and so there's a lot of pressure now in terms of trying to raise enough money to get to that value inflection point, what we call in the industry, where you can then use that data, whether it's clinical, preclinical, what have you, to then do the next financing, and how do you conserve cash to get you to that point. And I think there are a number of different models that people are using. A lot of semi-virtual companies are out there, which I think is becoming more of a norm than a cool trend over the years. So I think there are a number of different ways people are adapting to the availability of funds versus trying to get to a meaningful inflection point. And also, I think a lot of these companies don't want to raise too much money at low valuation, right? Because then you're giving up too much of your company before you actually have something of value where you can command higher premiums. So there's always a challenge. How do you work in a nimble way, with minimum amount of internal resource and partnering with academic or CROs to try and conserve cash. And also along the way, there's always this talk about pricing pressure on the products, and so that also creates significant hurdle for projects that you choose, right? So if you're in the rare disease space, it used to be that it's a given that you can think about charging a lot of money because it's a rare disease, and chances are you'll get good pricing. But now that may be changing as well, over the years. So we have to be mindful of that. But I think in the end, if you still have something very transformative, the money is out there, right? So you can actually raise this money and build a company. So we've been quite fortunate that way so far.
So one of the things that we've talked about is funding, and that being one of the constraints in terms of getting companies further along and faster. The other thing that I thought was interesting and perhaps would be helpful to comment on is, we need to build the teams in order to move those companies forward. Can you talk a little bit about either the opportunities or challenges that you see with virtual working models, with finding the talent to help bring that technology forward? It's not just additional scientific minds, but it's also going to be the people that are going to be putting the foundations to this company and making the operations of the day-to-day work as well.
Maybe I can launch on that first. So Neon was founded around June, July last year with about 4 people. We are just over 30 right now. And so we've undergone extremely rapid growth. And that was non-trivial. I mean, the amount of efforts that we had to put in to hire great people, and even before that, have a really solid plan on what expertise we needed, where we could source that from, that was a huge effort. And fortunately, we have Third Rock to leverage, where they actually have dedicated people in-house who can act as, in-house recruiters for us. That's not, in any way a normal situation, a normal startup situation. And then a big dynamic was that we wanted people with specific domain expertise in the lab or in the clinic, who could speak exactly towards that thing that we wanted to address. And which meant that we actually looked at a lot of academics and in fact hired a lot of academics straight out of their postdoc or pre-postdoc. We've got a bunch of different, even junior level RAs coming straight from academia, and even more senior people too. And that has its own unique set of challenges too, right? Because these guys are just so enmeshed in the science and so deep in that knowledge, but haven't worked in industry before. And so, there's adaptation that has to happen from both sides.
Well, I think we're really lucky here in this ecosystem with respect to the talent pool that exists all around us. The academics, for sure, we have them in abundance, but all the companies, the big ones and the small ones, there's a fair bit of churn of talent moving through these companies. And as I've seen it happen, there's enough people who are interested in moving on to something new and exciting that you can find those people here. I think doing that somewhere else in this country might be really hard to do. But as I've seen it more from a distance, that actually works quite well.
And I think the competition for talent is intense as well, right? So it comes with that. So, and I can, relate to that, from our company perspective. So, so clearly, good people are in short supply. And so there are a lot of these companies are looking for, not only senior level people at the, CFO levels or medical officers and so on. They're in really short supply, but also, layer down, in the mid management and as well as at the scientist levels. When I used to live in the Bay Area during the .com era, that used to be like, there's so much intense competition in the tech companies for people. Anyone who could program anything, they got a job, and then a week later they went to another job with 10% or 20% more, and so I think we're seeing some of that here in the Cambridge area, and I think in a way it's good because it's attracting talent from all over the world to this area, but also I think there's some level of the churn that you're spending time training some of these people, and there's no certainty that they're going to be around 6 months from now because they've been attracted by another headhunter to go to a company right next door, right? So.
Yes, and I think it to some extent depends on kind of the genesis of that startup, because I think some cases are more systematic and others are more opportunistic. So what I've kind of noticed is with the ones that have been incubated at a venture firm for a while and then they come out, they kind of have this network of people that they almost, rightfully so, kind of predetermine who everyone's going to be at the C-level, and you kind of figure it out there, and then they try to recruit the rest of the group. In our case, where we didn't come in from that kind of context, it was much more opportunistic. So we hired my former coworkers, or people that our advisors or board members would recommend for a C-level position or elsewhere. Or we met, for example, Amy Schulman, our executive chair, through Bob, who was formerly at Pfizer. So it was a much, much more opportunistic build-as-you-go kind of thing, as opposed to a well thought out plan of, all right, we're going to hire this recruiter we already know for these 5 positions and pull in these other 4 people we know for the C-level positions.
I could say a couple more words. So one of the, for us, for Sunrise Ventures, that's one of the reasons we actually like to partner with venture firms, because they usually have sort of a stable of individuals to tap into that also could be even entrepreneurs in residence that are sitting within the firm. But one of our biggest challenges is when we're launching a new co, and typically the academic investigator is not leaving their day job to go and run the company. And how do we find the right individuals to come into this company, at the seed stage and actually represent the company? Because we are not, as Sanofi, we're not trying to, while we want to negotiate rights that we want, we're not negotiating the licenses from the universities. And so there's sort of a hole there that we need to fill. We actually don't have a stable, supply of entrepreneurs in residence that are ready to launch a company, but it's something that we'd very much like to build, and we'll be accessing from our network. The one story I can tell briefly is the company that we've launched in Florida. We haven't formally announced this yet, but it's in the animal health space. And finding someone who could run this company, serve as the CEO in Florida, in Gainesville, in animal health. It turns out we contacted a venture firm who had exactly the right person sitting in Florida with animal health space. It was amazing. But that doesn't happen very often.
It's the power of connection, right? And it's been helpful to hear about all of the different models that exist. Maybe I could ask Bob, just to comment on that, from an academic research perspective, you've been involved with and started a number of companies. Can I just get a comment from you on kind of what that's like in terms of finding the right people to help bring this technology out of the lab and then into kind of more of that commercial world as we're trying to develop this and bring this to market?
Well, I think it is the most important thing. I mean, my feeling is a company will succeed or fail more on the people than even on the technology. But I agree with Tyler. I mean, the good thing about the Boston, Cambridge area is it's gotten better and better as it's gotten to be such an incredible hub for these companies. So, I mean, but it is the key thing. I mean, and to me as an academic, I mean, I feel like when people ask me about how successful different companies are that I've been involved in, what are the number one factor, I usually say, sadly, to me, it's how good our business people are rather than our scientists. Because the fact is that especially in the medical area, it takes so much money to create these things, and you don't get that many shots on goal because it's so expensive. It's not. So having really great business people is just so essential. And even here, that's not always so easy to find. And it's also something, to me as an academic, I mean, I feel like I'm a pretty good judge of who's a good scientist. I'm not as good a judge of who's necessarily a great business person. I mean, I'm okay, but I'm not great, and I think that that really is just so important. But I'd come back to what Tyler said again. I feel fortunate that Boston over Cambridge over the last 30, 40 years has gotten to be a better and better place. It's one of the best places in the world, maybe the best place in the world.
Well, with that, we wanted
better than Gainesville.
With that, we wanted to open it up to the floor. There are lots of brilliant minds in this room as well, so we'd invite anybody who wants to ask a question. There's a mic that's floating around. I guess if you have a question, maybe just raise a hand and we'll bring the mic over to you.
Hi, my name is Ali. I'm a doctoral here at MIT Sloan. Thank you very much to the panel. I have a question for Tyler, Bob, and the rest of the panel. When you look in the future, 5-10 years from now, and how the future of cancer research will evolve, specifically with the emergence of big data and healthcare analytics and artificial intelligence that's enabling personalized medicine and genomic diagnostics with companies like IBM with its Watson artificial intelligence. platform really bidding the company or Google diving to that area as well. How do you see that translate to cancer research at places like MIT or startups doing that kind of business?
Well, I'll start and just say a couple of things. Obviously, we're in that era now, and it will only increase with more information and more powerful ways of analyzing that information. But to take two examples, in the diagnostics space, before long, I think, we will be in a situation where, based on patterns of mutations detected in circulating DNA in the blood, individuals will be assessed for their cancer risk, maybe diagnosed with a particular cancer. But that's a huge challenge because of the diversity that exists within cancers and understanding what mutations or combinations of mutations are reflective of what disease state. We're really just getting into the complexity of that. So I would imagine that the power of big data and data analytics will help us solve that problem. Technically, we're pretty close to doing the generation of the information, but how you use that information to make accurate predictions, we're still a ways away. So that would be one. And the second is understanding tumor evolution, so with an existing tumor, and how the tumor changes with respect to its treatment response and resistance. Huge and challenging problem. Cancers are malleable, they're mutable, and they're clever. So figuring out the various pathways that exist for cancer cells to survive therapeutic challenge will require that sort of deep analytics. And again, we're not there yet, but hopefully that will be a way to understand all the roads that cancer cells can take and block them more effectively.
I'll affirm that, and Neon is taking a big data approach to neoepitopes and mutations and how they play a role in cancer, which means that we'll be collecting, I think, one of the most comprehensive data sets of DNA and RNA of tumors compared to patients, and hopefully that will allow us to figure out the ideal way to address therapeutics to stimulate immune responses. But what Tyler said is absolutely true. I think cancer is one of these things. You think that you've got the best thing. I mean, even from the days of original chemo or radiation or targeted therapies or T cells and others, you think you have the panacea, but you never do. And the complexities of the genomics, cancer genomics, we're really at that tip of the iceberg right now, and we'll be able to accurately get a snapshot of that particular tumor at that point in time. But even then, to understand that is non-trivial because of tumor heterogeneity, because you're sampling one site, not the 6 other metastatic sites, let alone the primary. You're doing this pre or post particular therapy that completely changes the makeup of the tumor, and even then, you can have as much processing power as you want, but if you don't have the right analytics to look at the things that are really important, you might as well go somewhere else. So all of that, I think, is emerging. I think there's a very strong future for that, but we're still in early days.
Any other questions?
I'll have one. I'll abuse my mic, and then we can give it to Michael. One word from each of the panelists, please, on if we wanted to improve this Kendall Square cancer ecosystem by 10x. Give me one word for where we should do that. Takes me that long to walk over there. This is MIT. You can figure it out.
One word.
People, technologies, ecosystem. Where should we invest?